Excellent. So good evening and welcome to our second to last session. You've been with us already for a week and a half, and we very much appreciate you being here and taking the time to do this training, and we're almost at the end. So we have a really exciting second to last session for you tonight about global policies for climate justice. So as a reminder, again, we ask for your presence and for you to be fully with us during the session so you can fully participate and make the most out of it. Please remember our microphone etiquette and also our participation, positive attitude, and we will have space for questions as well as some breakout groups. So just a reminder, in our breakout groups, we're going to be mindful of the time so that everyone has an opportunity to speak. But otherwise, this is a review of what we've gone over in the other sessions, as well as with our DEIJ communication agreements. So just the big reminder is always to speak from the I perspective, from your own experience, and not speaking for others. So, and there's multiple ways to see the solutions on these issues. There's no quick fix. We all want to solve the climate crisis, and there's many different challenges as are many different solutions. So our agenda for tonight is very nice. We have our welcome and introduction. We're going to have a presentation from WEDO, some Q&A, a presentation from Care About Climate, Q&A, and then from Climate Reality Europe as well. And some breakout groups to talk about setting up for next session. So our session today, we're going to be talking about global policies. And one of the things we are going to be focusing on are NDCs. So for those with cameras on, if you know what an NDC is, go ahead and give your camera a cover so that we don't see you. So who knows what an NDC is? Okay, so I see some cameras covered, some not covered. In 2015, the Paris Agreement was signed by 196 countries. So it was a global agreement that everyone agreed to. And the main mechanism of the Paris Agreement was, or is, the NDCs. So a nationally determined contribution. This means countries themselves are deciding what their climate actions are going to be and what measures that they are going to take on mitigation and adaptation. So how are they going to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions? How are they going to deal with that? And it's determined by each country themselves. And this is because in our past climate agreements, this was done what we call top-down, where it was agreed at the international level of who was going to be reducing by how much and by when with penalties. So the Paris Agreement and the NDCs is a reaction to a failure of a previous agreement, and so that's why it's bottom up. And while there are problems with that, that is the solution that we are working with today. And countries submit the NDCs on a 5-year basis, and we then see where the gaps are and what we can do better and how we can progress with a high level of ambition. So we are going to, I see that Mara has arrived, and we're going to get into more detail about what the NDCs are. Oh, the NDC acronyms. Yes, nationally determined contributions is the one that we'll use again. And the other acronyms we're going to hear today are the UNFCCC or UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. They also have the Secretariat, and that's the UN body where countries are under the agreement in which countries meet. So yes, and it is, I am not sharing slides for the NDCs, but you'll be comfortable with these acronyms in less than an hour, I think. So, but without further ado, Mara, if we are starting, is here already? Yes?
Hi, I am here.
All right.
Um, Wonderful. I'm curious first, is Haley presenting on sort of NDCs broadly? I didn't sort of incorporate like an overview to NDCs. I just jump right into a gender analysis of NDCs. So I'm curious if does that order make sense, or does doing a quick like primer on NDCs first make sense? I'm not quite sure what's come before this in the sequence or series.
They had a pre-exercise. So the pre-assignment was to look at the national NDC on one of the NDC trackers. So there's a little bit of familiarity, but maybe not super much.
Okay, wonderful. So y'all are experts. Okay, great. Well, if folks have questions, I know Hailey, I'm not sure if you're here yet, Hailey, but we work with Hailey a lot, and Hailey's also an expert on NDC, so we'll probably get more into that as well as we go. Um, but I'll just start with introductions. My name is Mara. I use she, her pronouns. I work at the Women's Environment Development Organization, which is a global advocacy organization that works at the intersection of gender and climate justice. And we really focus on um, policy advocacy and movement building at the global level and primarily in the UN multilateral space. So under the UNFCCC, under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, but also in some of the related and connected multilateral spaces such as CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity, CSW, which is the Commission on the Status of Women, and others. So NDCs are really kind of the anchor by which we understand countries to be putting forth their plans of action to align with the Paris Agreement and to be acting in good faith under the UNFCCC. But we really do see that related to sort of broad global justice and global advocacy work across the multilateral forum that we are in. So at WEDO, I work as well on sort of US programs and connecting US advocacy to our global advocacy. And I also do some work around NDCs. So I'm going to be sharing a particular tool that WEDO created right ahead of the intersessionals, which were in June and are the sort of like halfway point between the Conference of Parties, of which we are coming up to. And I'm sure you all have talked extensively about that. And we really put out this tool on NDCs ahead of the intersessionals because we knew we were entering this moment, this season, starting with the SBs in June, of countries really ramping up the attention paid, the work being done, and the consultations being held around NDC creation ahead of this timeline of releasing them before February of next year. But we'll really see those, I think, start to trickle in over the next few months. And there will be a lot of conversation and momentum and energy around NDCs this COP. Okay, so the way that I have sort of structured thinking about this, let me go ahead and screen share if that's okay. Oops, not this one. There we go. So how I'm really thinking about this is that it's perhaps useful as a group that is coming into this space with a particular focus on gender justice and how we're thinking about gender as interfacing with not only climate justice broadly, but specifically the UNFCCC process, the climate negotiations, and NDCs as an anchor by which we understand to advance the negotiations. So there's kind of two sections here, and I've asked my colleague to record a video for this first bit on gender at COP29. She's actually at or on her way to the Convention on Biological Diversity right now, which is being held in Colombia in a few days. And so she recorded a video for us, and that's okay. So we're going to share this presentation. And then I'll jump in after that video ends to just really take what she's sharing around sort of the progress that has been made around gender in the negotiations and where gender stands at COP29 and connect that to the NDCs process and the NDCs at COP29 and sort of where we're at in advocacy around putting justice at the center of NDCs broadly, but more specifically sort of where gender sits within that conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and do my best to find a way to share a video. You guys are really seeing my my tech skills or lack thereof in action. But this should work out fairly easily. Thanks for bearing with me, y'all. So, by way of introductions, this is Claudia Rubio, who is my colleague, who is the gender point focal point for the Women and Gender constituency, which is the official feminist and gender justice caucus at the UNFCCC, and coordinates all of our gender work in the UN space. And she'll share a bit on the status of gender at COP29. Let me make sure. Can you all hear this? No? Okay.
No.
No sound.
No worries. Thanks for letting me know. I just have to make sure I share sound as well. Okay, and now?
So today we want to dig a little
Yes.
bit deeper into gender at COP29. And for that we have to first analyze the history of gender within the UNFCCC. So of the sister Rio conventions, the UNFCCC was the only one that made no mention of women's rights or of gender equality. Prior to 2001, where we had the first standalone decision in gender, there was no language that had like specific references to gender or to women. Then in 2001, when we had that first decision that mentioned gender, that decision was about gender balance and like women's participation within the UNFCCC. And although this took like so long, it was this first like milestone towards really starting to mention and integrating like gender responsive or like at least like gender sensitive climate action. So with that into consideration, then we started to see like real advocacy around gender with the creation of things such as like the Women and Gender constituency and specific advocacy around gender, and just like this real like intentional growth on and strengthening of the advocacy to drive gender responsive climate action. There's like right now that progress is evident and that advocacy really has bear fruit. We have more than 120 decisions in the UNFCCC on different negotiation streams that mention gender. There's just like this, the Women and Gender constituency is like a really strong constituency that really has like clear like advocacy as there's like this real sense that gender has become like part of all the basically like all of the negotiation streams across like finance and adaptation and the gender item itself. Since then we can also mark that as progress. Gender has become like a standing item agenda, a standing item in the agenda, and yeah, basically gender has really like flourished in a way. One of the other milestones that we see for gender is the development of the Enhanced Lima Work Program and the Gender Action Plan. Initially, the Lima Work Program had been developed for 2 years. When we saw that the progress, and this happened in COP20, so in 2014. So with the adoption of the two-year Lima Work Program, we really saw like a specific work program on gender. Then after this, there was the Gender Action Plan, which was also adopted in 2017. And finally, in 2019, we saw the renewal of the Gender Action Plan and the Lima Work Program, but this time for a 5-year frame. So why is gender this year important specifically? Because gender at COP29, this is the year that's poised for renewal of the Gender Action Plan and the Lima Work Program. It's the year where we basically see like are expecting not only a renewed work program and action plan, but a strengthened one that like can like work on the things that we saw that were, let's say, challenges regarding the previous work program and the previous action plan, And now we really want to see like how those problems are renewed and how parties really come to like to integrate things into the gender action plan, such as indicators to measure progress, more like party level actions, or like how to really integrate decisions that such as the Lima work program or the gender action plan that have like this like very like international scope into a more national scope. So that's like one of the that's why gender is important this year at COP29, because this is the year that we need a renewal of the Lima work program to continue having the Lima work program, and a renewal of the gender action plan. So why is the gender action plan important, and why is this work program important? Basically, like, this work program and this gender action plan really like have enhanced gender responsive climate action. They've given us space for gender. They've brought gender to the table. There are challenges, of course, regarding this work program, like, for example, the fact that this like there's this sentiment that gender has been a little bit siloed, because this has been siloed from other negotiation streams. But on the other hand, or like the, for example, national gender climate change focal points, which are the designated focal points for gender within the UNFCCC, that their role hasn't been like formulated enough, or there's like several challenges regarding the gender work program and the gender action plan. But at the same time, there's so many like strengths. Like, it has driven like attention, it has driven gender responsive climate action. It's like just brought light to the topic. So what do we see here? The gender action plan is divided in 5 priority areas: capacity building, one in capacity building, knowledge management and communication; 2, gender balance, women's participation and women's leadership; 3, coherence; 4, gender responsive implementation and means of implementation; and 5, monitoring and reporting. So considering this, these are like the 5 areas that we already see in the gender action plan. So what are we this year like really advocating for in COP29? We're advocating for a gender action plan the way we can measure more progress. So like the last gender action plan did not have measures for adequately like outlining progress and like understanding like process. They didn't have like process oriented indicators. They didn't have like that request for like data and gender disaggregated data to really understand how is this being implemented and like how are parties implementing it. So the hope is that a new gender action plan would really have like clear ways of measuring how it's being implemented. We also would want to see intersectionality. So basically like recognizing that not only gender matters, but like other intersecting identities. So like sexual orientation, religion, race, social class, like all of these other intersecting identities that can exacerbate vulnerability in certain groups or can reduce vulnerability in certain groups. We would also want to see more like, as mentioned, like party level action. So like really understanding how do we implement this at a national level. Also seeing the participation, like making like sure that traditionally marginalized groups are being integrated into the process of developing the gender action plan, but also implementing the gender action plan, and that these groups can be like agents of change. And we would also want to see more gender responsive climate finance. So the idea there's designated ways of receiving finance to actually like operationalize the gender action plan and the work program. So these are like several of the components that we want to see within the gender action plan and within the Lima work program. But above all, we really want to like highlight to the presidency that this has to be like an essential year for gender, that gender cannot be ignored, and that this work program and this gender action plan really guides and strengthens gender responsive climate action in the UNFCCC. And that means that it impacts parties all over the world. So thank you so much. We'll pass it to my colleague Mara.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks for bearing with me for the video, folks, and I'll share the video itself afterwards in case there were parts that weren't so clear. And shout out to Claudia, who filmed that in the airport getting ready to head to CPD, which is a massively important sort of negotiating space in which gender needs to be present as well as COP. So we're really entering a busy season for multilateral moments. So as Claudia really, I think, tried to convey around the importance of this moment, we have seen immense gains around gender as a negotiating area in the UNFCCC space. So in the official decisions that are being made and agreed to by parties to the Paris Agreement. But that does not necessarily always translate to national action, right? That doesn't necessarily translate to the decisions and the policies and the resources that are being allocated at a national level around climate action. And that's really where the NDCs come in, because NDCs are nationally determined contributions, and in many ways, one of the tools in the toolbox of plans and policies that countries have to lay out how they are going to be actually aligning their climate action to their commitments that they have made under their Paris Agreement. So how we understand sort of gender and the NDCs.
Sorry, Mara, just quickly, we do not see your screen currently.
Oh, thanks for
Yeah,
letting me know.
no worries, since you were switching from the video.
Thank you. Okay. So I'll just quickly go through these. I know we're a little short on time. So around NDCs as sort of a tool, I'll go through this very quickly because I think the point has been conveyed, and I think Hailey will also get to this. We really understand NDCs to be signals of priorities and of commitments that will be made around translating international agreements to national action. And gender has to be a critical component of that. And as we heard, gender is very much on the agenda and is a critical priority at this year's COP. And if we do not have a renewal of the Lima Work Program, there will be huge consequences for gender as a negotiating area and as a priority area around climate action for years to come. So WEDO has worked on sort of NDC tracking and advocacy for some time. These are just some resources that I'll be happy to share in a follow-up email that should be useful to folks. But the Gender Climate Tracker is the sort of key preeminent resource that's available for folks to see in your national context. Where is gender in national climate policies and planning? So the Gender Climate Tracker includes tracking of legislation, news, articles, research around gender and climate globally. And you can search by country, you can search by year, you can search also understanding progress over a year. So please do play around with that tool, especially if you are working in local or regional context, to understand sort of what are the tools already at your disposal that are available to you to build from. And there is additionally an advocacy brief a few years ago that is just kind of useful to see sort of what's the change and the transformation and how we are understanding NDCs in this moment of reiterative NDCs. So it's the second iteration of NDCs, but there are going to be critical things that they are building from in the first iteration, which were in 2021, that are shared across our advocacy from then to now. So the key tool that I want to share with folks that I hope is useful in your work and in your advocacy is this tool that we launched a few months ago called Towards Gender Just Nationally Determined Contributions. And we really are aiming for it to be a screening tool, so something that is useful to really hold up against sort of what governments are presenting to us as the progress that they are making or the commitments they are planning on including in their NDCs, and comparing it to what we know is necessary for gender just action within NDCs, right? And in addition, it includes a bunch of resources. So when inevitably in meetings or in conversations in which you are asked to explain what you mean, there are a plethora of resources out there, not only from WEDO, but from other incredible civil society organizations. Care About Climate is for sure on there. Hailey's presenting next. But the wealth of sort of civil society-led resources on NDCs and what determines and can create a just NDC are plentiful. So I'm going to stop sharing quickly and drop the link in the chat so that folks can go ahead and check it out while I am chatting. But I'm just going to walk you through sort of what the key 6 areas that the tool includes as critical sort of consideration areas around making sure an NDC is gender just. So here is the link. feel free to pull that up. And just to be incredibly brief, folks can go ahead and open this and they'll see a bit of introduction and context setting before it immediately walks you into the elements of consideration, which include process, principles, ambition, data, coherence, and accountability. And you might be thinking, you know, those 6 words, like none of them even have gender in them. And this is really a big part of, I think, feminist orgs and women's rights organizations and gender justice organizations have for years said, you know, our priority is not to just add language of gender or add language around gender justice and stir. It's really about understanding that gender is critical to all elements of climate action. And we don't want to be mainstreamed into a polluted stream, as is a quote that we often talk about. We really actually have a systemic analysis that is approaching all climate policy and planning, including NDCs, from the perspective of where would gender show up in every element of this production, creation, consultation, and implementation and sort of reflection. So each of these pieces are where gender really, I think, has the potential to show up in entrenching inequality or transforming realities and actually moving us towards gender justice. So around process, this one is something that is happening right now. You know, countries are
Mara, do
sorry.
you have PowerPoint for this?
No, I actually am just asking folks to follow along in it's just the tool. So I figured it would be fairly boring to present. But I have linked the resource. So if folks are interested in pulling it up, this is what I'm speaking about right now. So the first one around process is the piece that in many ways is happening right now in governments, offices and departments that are working on NDCs. The process of NDCs varies wildly and widely in countries. In some places, it might be something that one person is writing and getting feedback on. In others, it might be several different departments that are working on it together. In some contexts, it's a process that takes several months. In some contexts, it's something that's much shorter. There is no rule book for how an NDC must be created. And so we really see quite a bit of variation around process. And this is where the process around consultation and inclusion of all folks who will be impacted by NDCs, but particularly those who are on the front lines of climate impacts, including women, girls, queer folks, folks with disabilities, Indigenous folks. This is where we really need to see strong consultative processes that will actually include their priorities, perspectives, and demands in an NDC. So you'll see in this document, there's information on sort of how we understand process to be a point around NDCs that could advance gender justice, and then includes key questions to ask of yourself in reflections on NDCs, as well as potentially in conversation with policymakers or other advocates who you know are working on NDCs. So those key questions sort of invite reflection on these pieces around process. And then the list of resources includes more information on process. So we only include a brief paragraph on sort of the potential harms and transformation for process, but there are plentiful resources out there that dive more deeply into it. Second is around principles. So really, what are the ways that core principles around a gender just transition need to be included in an NDC in order to not entrench inequality, but actually to advance it? Here we're thinking about things such as, you know, in NDCs, it's common for countries to name what are commitments around the transition of fossil fuel workers, and that is critical and important, and that is not necessarily how feminists understand the scope of a just transition. We know that just transition includes all workers, and that workers includes care workers who are overwhelmingly women, and we really need to be thinking more holistically about the principles of what climate action around a just transition looks like within NDCs, to not necessarily exclude communities, but specifically exclude women. Third, we have ambition, which is really around catalyzing action that meets the scale and ambition that science and justice demand. Fourth is around data. We know that data around gendered distinctions or differentiated sort of gendered impacts to climate are incredibly lacking. It is something that governments often do not invest in finding, and without good data, we can't make good policy, right? So this piece around data and how sector-specific and gender differentiated experiences, impacts, and needs is critical in data collection. 5 is coherence. So that is something that Claudia was really speaking to, is we have a vast infrastructure of gender-related decision-making and existing sort of fora and policies that speak to gender. What is the way that coherence is ensuring that they actually are mutually supportive rather than duplicative or even undermining each other? And 6 is accountability around, we know that NDCs are intending to facilitate government's commitments to climate action, and there need to be mechanisms for advocates to actually hold their governments accountable for the processes, the data use, the adherence to principles that they have laid out as intended in their NDC. So what are the ways that the kind of tracking and recording of progress is available to civil society, is available to advocates, and is something that can be used in accountability processes through the years as we take stock of action. And lastly, on the final page, you'll see a checklist, which actually includes the 6 categories and the questions that are included as sort of key reflection questions as folks are analyzing NDCs, your own NDC or other NDCs, and thinking about what are the ways that putting justice at the center could be strengthened by sort of asking and answering where there are still room to grow in the answers to these questions. So I think I'm far over time. I'm so sorry, folks. But I'll stop there. I'll drop the link again to the tool in the chat and encourage folks to check it out, to see how it's useful to you. We aim for it to be useful for advocates and folks who are in movement building and policy spaces. If you have questions or are interested in being more in conversation around gender just NDCs, please do reach out. I'll put my email in the chat. And as well, this is an open invitation for folks to join the Women and Gender constituency. It's an open movement building space that welcomes any climate advocates who are really interested in strengthening their own gender justice analysis and being a part of the sort of broad collective work to do so at the UNFCCC. So I'll add a little bit more information in the chat and pass back to the facilitators. I also am happy to combine Q&A with Hailey if she's speaking about additional things. So if that makes sense on timing. Over to y'all. Thanks for the time.
Thank you so much, Mara. That was a really comprehensive and fascinating overview for the gender aspects of the NDCs. I see that we have, and now my chat is disappearing. There's a couple questions in the chat. Maybe we can go over them quickly. And if you're able to stay with Hailey, maybe we can hit more of those together as well. But the first question that's here is, in the video, it was mentioned especially that it's important to appeal to the COP presidency this year, which is Azerbaijan, and how much influence does the host country itself and its existing gender-related policies and practices have outcomes on things like negotiations around the gap? So how much influence is there on the presidency to the agenda set?
That's a great question, and Claudia would certainly be able to speak more in depth about this, and I can follow up as well. But from my understanding as someone who sits a bit outside of those negotiations is that the presidency certainly has impacts across the board on negotiating tracks. They are responsible for a lot of the agenda setting, but that at the end of the day, the UNFCCC and the Conference of Parties are collective consensus processes, and all countries who are a party to the Paris Agreement have the ability to really sort of shape the collective priorities, and that much of that happens actually ahead of COP and ahead of the intersessionals themselves. So we are working on sort of a set timeline around the review of the Lima Work Program and the progress of it. And I think any sort of any negotiating track or work program, the presidency certainly has an impact on how it is presented, what is the narrative around it, what is its priority in the space, but that they are not sort of the sole determinant of it. And there is very much an understanding that it is a consensus-driven process. And not only are there parties, parties is another word for governments, of course, parties to the Paris Agreement who are there pushing for their own priorities and their own understanding of what should be top of the agenda, but also civil society. There are 9 constituencies who are each representing their own agendas and priorities and pushing for justice and a voice for civil society in the negotiations who have influence in their own way. And so it is very much sort of a complicated array of influence, but that I would say some, but not in sort of an understanding that they're like the only decision maker in this space. Hope that's helpful.
Thanks so much. Swati, I see your hand up and we'll have time for one quick question, but I'm going to use my facilitator's privilege to ask a question as well. So looking at the NDCs, I'm curious, is there an example of a NDC or provision of an NDC that's done especially well with consideration to gender? Any country, is there a good example that we can look to as something that's been done well?
Ooh, that's great. Swati, should I maybe take both questions and then I'll answer them together for time? I think you're muted, Swati.
Hi, Mara. I used to work with your colleague from New York in UN about 20 years ago. I forget her name. She was shot. I don't know, you can help me. But my first question is, do you keep track of the countries who are member state? You know, they have difficulties in paying their member state dues, and they are having difficulties in paying the NCDs. And do you keep track of if there is any discrimination for those countries, woman related? Like, you know, are there any gender issues pertaining to those countries who don't pay the NCDs? Did you get what I'm asking?
So to clarify, Swati, you're asking about the financial commitments that might be included
because
in.
Yeah, because NCDs are over and above what a country has to pay as a due to be a member state. So you know, the NCDs are totally voluntary in fashion. Nobody holds a country accountable for paying the NCDs. So in that case, who keeps track of woman-related or gender-based violence or, you know, gender-based discrimination? Because most of the time women are the ones who are in farming, or they have cooperatives, or they are self-employed. They are the ones who get impacted by climate change, you know, because their daily wages are impacted by climate change, the people who are dependent upon the daily wages. So how do you keep track of these things?
No, that's a great question. Thank you, Swati. So, and also wonderful to know that you had worked with a previous WEDO colleague. I wasn't here 20 years ago, so I'm not sure who it was, but I'll ask around on my team and see.
We used to work a lot. WEDO is, I should say, WEDO's leadership is really so pivotal in, you know, giving voice to women. And I've seen that over in time in Commission on Status of Women, in CEDAW, in Commission on CBDs, in Commission on Sustainable Development, all places, WEDO plays a very pivotal role in, you know, raising voice for women's issues. And I also wanted to ask, do you guys accredit women who don't have an NGO status to participate in UNFCCC? Suppose anyone who is in this group wants to attend Baku, do you think WEDO can give them an accreditation? Because that's the
Great question.
Without that, you cannot attend UNFCCC.
That's right.
And it's such pain, if you don't have an NGO which has got an ECOSOC status, you cannot participate. So, and you cannot even enter the main hall to negotiate. So, yeah.
Absolutely. No, excellent questions. Thank you, Swati. So, to answer the first question on sort of NDCs to learn from, though we are careful, of course, to sort of ascribe an NDC as doing it the right way, because I think as we are really clear in our analysis and advocacy, NDCs are so context specific, and there are really critical ways that process and key consultation will illuminate some of the distinct contextual differences that are important for NDCs, and for NDCs to speak to the wide contexts that also exist within a country, right, which is so key. But we do, of course, always want to lift up sort of examples of NDCs that are doing really interesting or innovative work around gender, and the ways that process and consultation and data are included in it. So I just want to specifically drop this resource that we put out a few years ago that was in my presentation as well, which is a spotlight on specific NDCs and how gender is included, as well as just say we actually recently held a panel with focal points where Uruguay, Cambodia, and Malawi all spoke to specific ways that gender are showing up in their NDCs and how they are, as focal points, working to even strengthen that more. And so those three countries are really interesting NDCs to read and to also get a wide range of sort of regionally diverse approaches to how folks are thinking about gender in NDCs. And then to the second question, so NDCs don't actually include, they don't have to include climate finance commitments. Climate finance is climate finance is a behemoth. There is so much to unpack there, and I'm sure there might be additional sessions that you all are talking about climate finance in depth inside the UNFCCC and outside of it in some of the other multilateral climate finance instruments, such as the Green Climate Fund and others. And so NDCs can include information on, as you named, they're voluntary. So they can include detail on needs assessment and financial commitments, but they don't have to. And when I say that NDCs vary widely, I really mean that some of them are like a page and some of them are really extensive and much longer. And so there's not a one size fits all approach. Climate finance is always a huge priority area at COP, but this COP in particular is actually being understood and sort of colloquially called the Finance COP. It is going to be the Conference of Parties COP, in which this thing called the NCQG is going to be decided. Apologies for all of the acronyms. NCQG stands for the New Collective Quantified Goal, and it is essentially the collective agreement at what the large assessment of finance needs around climate finance is globally. So as you can imagine, this is hugely political. It is something that countries who are the largest historical emitters and who are the wealthiest do not want to pay. And it is a matter of justice and fairness that they do. And countries who are demanding their right to climate finance and who are speaking around climate reparations and a broad understanding of redistribution of resources are really pushing for an ambitious and big NCQG. So that's going to be something that is front and center at this COP, and ensuring that countries are, as you're saying, committed to that financial action is something that feminist groups and civil society broadly see as a huge priority, because if the resources aren't there, then so much of what we are demanding around gender just climate action at the end of the day won't happen, right? So we know climate finance is central to so much of that. And I will put more information in the chat around joining the WGC. WEDO doesn't accredit organizations. Accreditation happens under the UN. Folks have to apply to the UN, but individual advocates join the Women in Gender constituency, and the Women in Gender constituency every year is able to host a process of sponsoring and traveling with advocates to COP as advocates who are coming to the negotiation. So if that's something you're interested in as an individual activist and advocate, that is something that is most welcome, and that the WGC always does its best to identify badges and resources to do so that there's a really strong representation of grassroots feminist activists who are present at COP and leading in that space. So I'll put some more information on the WGC in the chat and pass it back to the facilitators.
Thank you so much, Mara. It was really comprehensive. So thank you so much, and for all the resources. If you have a little bit of time, there's still some questions in the chat, but please only if you have time for it. We're running a little bit behind on time. So I would ask, before we introduce Hailey, if you do have a question for the next speaker during the Q&A, please put your question in the chat, and that way we can collect them together when there's similar questions, and that way we can maybe regain some of the time. So Hailey, I think I saw you somewhere. Yes. So I will then give you the floor. So Hailey Campbell from Care About Climate, welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. And that was also a really great presentation. So excited to be able to share more and follow a little bit along on the NDC route with you all today. Let me just share my screen. And I will keep my presentation a bit shorter then, and hopefully we can recoup some of that time for everyone. Let's just get it in present mode. All right, yay. So we just heard a lot of great information about the importance of gender within NDCs. And today I'm excited to expand a little bit more on gender, but also at the intersection of intergenerational justice, because we know, and the United Nations has told us that when these NDCs, these national climate action plans, include gender diverse and young people, they're often a lot more ambitious and a lot more impactful at ensuring that they meet the needs of those who are most vulnerable. And so here's me. My name is Hailey Campbell, and I'm the co-executive director of Care About Climate. My teammate, Ruth Holland, who is the NDC Equity Program Manager, prepared this presentation for us. Unfortunately, she's not able to be here today, but definitely want to make sure I'm acknowledging her and the work that she helped put in towards this presentation. And I'm based in the United States, and I've been involved with the climate negotiations for the last 4 years. I almost can't believe 5 years? 5 years. Oh my gosh. I can't believe that it's been that long. I started out as a young person who went to COP with my university without much of any training at all, and was really confused by what was going on. I'm sure a lot of you can relate, or maybe that's why you took this training, and had to really do a lot to teach myself and learn how to engage with policymakers and negotiators and all of these acronyms that we just learned about. And so it's really exciting to be able to now lead an organization that's making it a lot easier for young people to be able to get involved, and excited to be a part of trainings like the climate reality training that is making it even easier for us to get involved at any level with any topic area that we care about. So what are we going to be talking about today? First, here we are, Care About Climate. We are a youth-led organization, and though we are based in the United States in terms of our incorporation, because we want to take that global north money, right? We also are a global nonprofit in scope. My co-executive director is based in Nigeria, but we have 55 volunteers from 30 countries that are all working together. And so a lot of the work you'll see today is thanks to them. Our mission is to build a global movement of young people who have the skills and the confidence to impact climate policymaking and implement climate solutions at home and abroad. So currently, I'm talking to you today about our NDC Equity Project, but we also have an international climate policy and advocacy course. So if anyone is interested in getting more involved in the climate negotiations, I'll drop that link in the chat later, and we'd love to welcome you to that. We also have a climate clubs program that's helping young people really localize the climate policies in their communities. So on to the NDC Equity Tracker. All right. So the mission of the NDC Equity Tracker is to empower young people worldwide by training a network of NDC youth ambassadors to not only analyze and understand their country's NDC, but also to provide actionable recommendations that solidify gender and youth inclusion in these final outcomes. And so currently, our tracker has analyzed 80 countries, which represent 85% of global emissions. And 8 of those countries are within the top 10 of our global emitters, which is really, really important because these global emitters not only have a responsibility to, the global community to really reduce emissions, but also to take leadership and to finance and to support a lot of the communities, not just at home, but abroad in meeting their climate goals. Because they are the historical emitters, they have a larger responsibility. So it's really important that we're trying to hold their feet to the fire, so to speak, in order to make sure that they really are kind of leading in reducing their emissions in an equitable way. So, what are some of our impact stats? Here's our current presence by region. As you all know, the EU has one, or maybe you don't know this, but the EU actually has one shared NDC. So for all, I think there's 27 countries that are represented. Maybe I'm wrong, someone correct me. But they just have one shared goal overall. And so that's why it seems like Europe is really heavy, is because there's only one for a large portion of the continent. But we also have pretty good representation across all of the other areas from South America to North America, Oceania, Africa, and Asia. And just wanted to give you a bit of a breakdown of what kind of the overall tracker looks at. Overall, more than 60% of NDCs don't include young people in a meaningful way. So this doesn't just mean in a consultation or acknowledging that they're vulnerable. It also means ensuring that there are actual policies within the NDC that are aimed at strengthening long-term youth inclusion. So it's not just on one side of the coin to ask them what they think should be in an NDC. It's also about showing where that shows up, where those youth perspectives show up in the NDC and how they influence the changes to the overall outcome, but also what they're committed to in the long term. And so differently from WEDO's tracker or other trackers, we also have similar kind of calls to action for gender. And so though a lot of them actually mention gender or women, from the perspective of young people, they don't feel that 49% feel that they don't mention it in a meaningful way. And again, meaningful way for the purpose of this tracker doesn't just mean in consultations. It also means providing that gender disaggregated data that we just learned about. It also means specific policies, not just on women as farmers or women as caretakers and their vulnerabilities to climate change, but also in their role overall as contributors to the just transition, but also contributors to a lot of the solutions as policymakers too. So it really goes beyond just asking gender diverse and women what they think, but also really making sure the policies reflect what's needed to create these changes to kind of close that gender climate action gap that we just discussed. We also know that 100% of countries with stronger inclusion of gender and youth are more likely to have emissions reduction goals that are actually aligned with the Paris Agreement. And that's really, really important because all of the youth ambassadors think that their country's NDC can be improved, which maybe isn't surprising. So we're going to go through a couple quick highlights for all of you. As I mentioned, currently today what I'm presenting is about 28 countries. We have the UK and we have the European Union. So that's just a bit of an orientation for us. And what we find from the NDCs from Europe is out of the 31 countries that are represented, there is one in the top 20 emitting group of emissions, but on average together, their scores for their NDC ambitiousness and equity was an average of 40. And so this scoring system is on a scoring track from 0, which would represent a critically deficient NDC, which no countries have, as long as you have something, you get points. But 40 is considered average, meaning there are worse NDCs that do a significantly worse job at including young people and gender diverse communities. But there are also a lot of NDCs that do significantly better and are really exemplary in their efforts, which would give a score of about 80 to 100. What we also want to acknowledge is that the EU, or sorry, Europe in general, really does a good job at trying to be a leader in reducing their emissions and having stronger commitments that are closer to being aligned with the Paris Agreement. And so that's really important that they are showing a lot more leadership than other global north and developed countries. Cough, cough, perhaps the country I come from. So there is a lot more to be done, but some things are also really worth celebrating within our NDCs. I also want to acknowledge that the NDCs from Europe and in general don't necessarily do the best job at highlighting all the action efforts that countries are doing to tackle climate change. And so this project really mostly looks at the NDC itself, but it doesn't mean that the countries aren't potentially doing more with their individual related policies or efforts, but it's taking this broader look at what are they committing to on this global scale and can we hold them accountable to as a result of that. So I'm going to quickly do a little bit of an overview on youth inclusion. Both of the NDCs that were analyzed don't really have the most youth inclusive NDCs. They're both very much in the developmental stages of that process, and the higher score for youth inclusion was earned by the United Kingdom, but it was still labeled as insufficient. And the European Union's NDC actually only scored 5 points on youth inclusion, which means they only, as you can see here, they mentioned young people in the NDC, but they didn't have a reference to youth-based research. They didn't have recognition of any form of long-term youth engagement, such as a youth council that was represented within their NDC. The UK did reference youth in their NDC as well, and acknowledge their participation in the development process of the NDC. They also recognize youth as stakeholders, but there's still a lot more they can do in terms of long-term inclusion of young people. And so, as you see in the bottom side here, 2 out of 2 NDCs that include youth in its text, which is really important. There are countries that don't include young people at all. And so it is, again, important to celebrate that win, but also acknowledge that there exists this gap. So gender equality. The EU's NDCs or the Europe's NDCs scored average in gender equality. Both are still really falling short, as I mentioned. And so what this looks like for us is that NDCs that meaningfully include gender diverse communities not only reference the important role and vulnerabilities of them in the climate crisis, but also in implementing solutions and, of course, gender disaggregated data, as I mentioned before. The UK's NDC mentions women, recognizes their role as beneficiaries of climate action efforts and includes them in the development process, while the EU pretty much does the same, except for did not mention specifically how women were included in the development processes. And again, we are looking for NDCs that are really explicit in these acknowledgements because you want to ensure that they're aligned with things like the Gender Action Plan, but also aligned with what the commitments to gender justice are globally. So let's see, moving on. Emissions. So both of them, as I mentioned, did have a bit more ambition when it comes to emission reductions strategies. As we know, high emitting and developed countries have a higher responsibility to address climate change due to their contributions to the climate crisis. And so it's important that these are really, really ambitious. The UK says that they commit to reducing economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions by at least 68% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. And I want to take a quick pause to acknowledge this phrase, economy-wide. This is really important because there are some countries that will only mention reducing emissions in their transportation sectors or their energy sector or their waste sector. So it's really important that we're reducing emissions at all levels of our economy. So it's really exciting that they have that big of a bold commitment. And then the EU says the EU and its member states acting jointly are committed to a legally binding target of domestic reduction of net greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% compared to 1990 levels by 2030. So you'll notice in this one, it doesn't necessarily say economy-wide, it just says domestic reduction. So that could kind of come from wherever each country kind of decides that their emissions reductions could come from. It also says net greenhouse gas emissions, which is another important difference because net could indicate that countries are able to engage in some of the some solutions that are considered false solutions by a lot of Indigenous youth and other vulnerable communities. For example, a lot of the carbon capture technologies have been called as false solutions because, if we're doing net emissions, for example, that means I could go and run my factory, but as long as I, paid enough money to plant trees or paid enough money for something that could suck carbon out of the air and store it in the ground, then I could still emit my emissions or my greenhouse gases, however many I wanted to, right? And so those are the kind of the concerns with that word net, but it's still a much more ambitious target than compared to a lot of other countries. Less than 10% of the total global emissions, though, is emitted by both countries in the region. And so, though that is still significant, there are other countries that are on the hook for a lot more. So what are some of the recommendations from the analyses? Chloe from the EU said that the EU NDC must include young people in the consultation phase of the next NDC. If anyone here is a member of an EU country that has been consulted, would love to learn more from you. On gender mainstreaming, enhancing the next NDC by specifically including women in the consultation phase, taking their needs into account, and including transformative opportunities for them in kind of that just transition. So if you recall, it was really a glaring gap that gender diverse people and women were not necessarily explicitly consulted, or it wasn't explained well. And then lastly, from Annabelle on climate finance for youth, the UK must commit to providing financial and capacity building support to youth-led organizations, because there's a lot of work going on. And I bet oftentimes the governments are, much similarly to the United States, are overlooking those communities and those leaders that aren't necessarily the influencers, right? There's people that they don't know that are doing work. And so it's really important that that is considered and supported from our governments, because we are leading the just transition through a lot of our work and often taking on these roles in addition to school or other jobs. And so in order to help be a part of that green transition, that means this work that we're doing has to become paid work. So it's really, really important that that's acknowledged. I am going to skip this section. Actually, I'll quickly, people are interested, this is a little snapshot of what the tracker looks like. This is a deep dive into the EU's. They are 19th place in the tracker on gender. As I mentioned, critically deficient on youth inclusion, average on gender, but doing pretty exemplary on emissions reductions. I can drop the link to our website so you can do a deeper dive into all of this at a later date. But I wanted to quickly just share one more resource for everyone, which is the Youth NDC booklet for young climate advocates that was just created by UNICEF. Ruth and I had the honor of contributing to this booklet, but it really is a good guide that kind of explains NDCs in a really easy to understand way, and how you can also advocate for them. So I encourage you all to kind of look into this booklet for more ways to engage. And if we have time, these are my questions for you. If anything surprised you most about the results shared today, or if there's anything, that you'd want to see in your country's updated NDC, would love to hear it. But for now, definitely encourage you to get involved, follow us on our social media, and explore the website, ndcequitytracker.org, to learn more not just about your country, but other countries and how they stack up from one another. And yeah, I think that about sums it up.
Thank you so much, Hailey. That was fantastic. We have some questions in the chat. And maybe I will try and combine a question and reduce. So for the NDC analyses, do they include immigrants, residents that live in the EU, as well as how to make sure youth also with migrant backgrounds are included?
That's a really important question. And so our analysis does not specifically delineate one type of young person from another based off of, their characteristics. But I do think it's really important to acknowledge that, migrants, climate migrants, other migrants are really growing of importance to understand how we can better support those communities, especially because you probably know this, but climate change is not listed in kind of the refugee convention as a reason why someone could be considered a refugee. And so it's really important that that is explored. And for all of the analyses, we will be doing a new round of the analyses once the countries do submit their updated ones, hopefully by February 2025. And if you're interested in that as part of the topic, we're welcoming people to do the analyses, and they're always invited to add additional areas of interest or gaps that they recognize in their country's NDC. So we would definitely welcome that.
Thanks so much. So I'm going to speed a little bit ahead. And if you'd like to introduce the letter, and we can maybe start our action moment.
Yes. Okay. So action moment. What is really exciting about this work is that we all have an opportunity right now to influence our country's NDCs. And so since we are here today, we created at Care About Climate what we're calling the gold standard for youth inclusion in NDCs. And I think Jessica's going to share it in the chat or somewhere. But we are encouraging young people, and you're actually the first group of young people that we're encouraging this with. So you are a pioneer, to send a letter to their UNOCCC focal point, which we'll also share a link to that, calling for your country to be an advocate for youth inclusion in NDCs. And what we've done, here it is. All right. So what we've done with this letter is it's an opportunity for them to have a vision about what meaningful youth inclusion in NDCs looks like that comes from different NDCs across the NDC Equity Tracker, but also a call to action. So if you are interested in supporting this, you don't have to just be a young person who can advocate for this. Any person can advocate for youth inclusion. So I encourage you to go to the second link that Jessica mentioned to find your focal point, and then use the first link as a template for sending a letter to your focal point. Or if you happen to know government representatives, that's even better, who work on NDCs. And yeah, we can take maybe a minute if people want to send that. And I'll go ahead and send it over to my focal points in the US too, while we all do it together. Yay!
Great. Thank you so much, Hailey. And yeah, we're very happy that we can be a part of your campaign and use this space to really take action together. So just for everyone to know, we will upload this to the training platform, then you can have a look at it again. Yeah, and also have the list with your representatives. And you can also be an individual. Yes, of course. I mean, it is coming from you as an individual. And yeah, then we can also use the chat on the training platform to discuss, or in case you have any more questions when it comes to that. Okay. Thank you so much. I see that someone would like to have the link for the booklet on NDCs. Yeah, I think that was for you, Hailey. And I think that we will do a short break now. I'm sure that your brains must be steaming right now with a lot of information. But yeah, I think it is always very important to learn about global policies, and we always hear about all of these big conferences, but yeah, what do these words actually mean, and what is actually yeah, being discussed in these closed doors? Yeah, is always important to know a little bit. And thank you so much for our two speakers. It was probably be very difficult to race through these presentations, especially such a complex topic. So yeah, we will give a short 5-minute break, and then we will be back.
Just a really quick request. Do y'all want to take a group photo? We could maybe like cement this moment when we're kind of launching our call to action. If people would be
yeah,
willing.
of course. Who is good at taking screenshots? Because for me, usually, or sometimes it's not working. I just want to make sure.
I'm so down to take it, and I will email it to you.
Okay. I love your energy. Great.
It was my idea, so I feel like I can take the responsibility of taking it. We have to take maybe a couple because there's a few pages of people, so we'll just do like
yeah.
two or three rounds. So you might, I don't know who's going to
Okay.
be in which one, but you might be in there. So smile away. All right. I'm just gonna 1, 2, 3, and then take it. So it's gonna be like 4 seconds. All right. 1, 2, 3. Okay, that's one. Let me just make sure it's saved. All right, next page. All right, the next page of people. All right, everyone smile. This could be you again. 1, 2, 3. Incredible. And I think everyone else appears to be off camera. So we are good with the 2. Thanks for indulging me in that, everyone. And you can probably find this on Care About Climate social media. So follow us there as well. And I know Jessica will send it along. But thank y'all.
Thank you so much, Hailey, and see you all in 5 minutes. Okay, one more minute. And then to round it all up nicely, we will have a very short presentation by the branch manager of Climate Reality Europe about something a bit new, but it feeds into the NDCs, and it is also very important when it comes to EU policies, and also something that Climate Reality, together with our coalition partners, are advocating for. So yeah,
so
I guess,
should I go
yeah,
ahead?
Gosia, yes.
Okay, so let me see if I can present. Should be working in a moment. Is it working? It should
Yes.
be
Yeah.
okay. All right, so thank you to all previous speakers who are outlining the NDCs in more detail. So I will have less of a job to do right now. So just to introduce myself shortly before I go ahead, my name is Gosia. I'm the branch manager of the European branch of Climate Reality, and today I wanted to tell you more about the element of the European Union's NDC. That is an example of how social justice can be included in the NDC. So before I actually jump into it, and there will be several steps that I want to take back, I just wanted to say, why are we actually focusing on NDCs in our work, and why we also dedicated a session to NDCs during this climate justice training. So I think that it just really boils down to the fact that we don't have so much time, and that's the work that we should be really focusing on. Since the first climate targets are fast approaching in 2030. So the slide that I'm sharing right now is basically a presentation, like a representation of where we stand on climate action and on emissions reduction. So yeah, there's quite a lot of information here. But if we look at the global greenhouse gas emissions, we can see them steadily increasing up to year 2020. And then we see a slow decline here. And so if we look at the current policies and even the pledges and targets, which aren't really set into any policies, we are not really on a good pathway. Actually, the emissions reduction is not fast enough, while the Paris Agreement clearly shows us what is the pathway. And if we look at if we go back to year 2020, which we all remember as the COVID year, during that year, we actually dropped the emissions by 6 to 7%, approximately. So in fact, this should be the emissions reduction we should see every year until 2030. But it really shows that it's quite difficult to do this, even with the pledges and targets that are not yet set in policies. So definitely there's the need to accelerate action and put more pressure on decision makers to actually accelerate all the frameworks that will actually make it possible, right? So that's definitely very important for us as Climate Reality globally. International cooperation on climate is one of our 4 global campaigns. And we know that we need to put more pressure on decision makers, and we need to make this process of climate negotiations more accessible to people, more transparent. So that's why, yeah, we're focusing on the topic of NDCs, and we want to bring it closer to you, to climate-related leaders and our communities, and to be more informed about what type of pressure, we should all enforce on decision makers. So that's just to shortly show you why are we talking about this, because we really consider this as the most important challenge in front of humanity. Maybe AI is another one, but we're definitely focusing on this one here. And so with having said that, I wanted to go ahead with, just kind of going back into the flow of the discussion so far and talk about how social justice can be implemented in NDCs. So so NDCs are basically climate plans, in just trying to make a very a shortcut here, right? But these are plans of how countries want to lead to emissions reduction that is aligned with Paris Agreement. And now, with all the positive ambition there, with all the good intentions, this transition can disproportionately affect certain groups, particularly vulnerable groups. And this can happen in multiple ways. And of course, we talked already about the gender aspects, the aspects of youth inclusion, but these can be also quite across the whole society because of economic reasons, right? And here we talk about potential increase of energy costs, about job losses, and especially in those high carbon sectors. There's also displacement from unsustainable livelihoods. So without proper framework when it comes to social justice, we can actually risk widening social inequality. And so I just wanted to also bring back a few examples of what vulnerable communities are. So these could be groups that are facing socioeconomic marginalization. These could be low-income earners, the elderly, people with disabilities, or families living in rural areas or isolated areas with the reduced access to public infrastructure and services. So just to kind of have a vision of what groups are we talking about here, and I would be going back to vulnerable communities a few times in my presentation. So just wanted to make sure that we are on the same page when it comes to how we define those vulnerable communities. But of course, they're not reduced to those only, but just to give you a few examples. So now when we look at how we can link climate justice to NDC implementation, we need to make sure that NDCs will include specific tools, specific frameworks. So this could include tools that help protect vulnerable communities. These could be subsidies, concepts like energy sharing, or supporting vulnerable communities, increasing energy efficiency of their households, for example. Another set of solutions here is to ensure equitable access to the benefits of this transition, right? So that people have access to clean energy, that they can apply for sustainable jobs and can get sustainable jobs. And then that we build a system that is really preventing further marginalization of those groups, right? So there's definitely that element of really designing the system. It's not just about the transition from one energy source to another. It's really to design a system that is going to decrease inequalities as well. And so there's one example of that I would like to talk about today, which is the Social Climate Fund, a tool that is included in the EU NDC. But before I go into that, before I define it and tell you what exactly is that, I wanted to go back to the EU NDC. So if we think about what is the EU committing to, there's the emissions reduction target, so minus 55% greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 compared to levels from 1990. There's the climate neutrality by 2050. And this is something that is actually embedded in the European law. It is actually called the European Climate Law. So not all of the NDCs are actually embedded in laws in countries, but it is in fact the case for the European Union. So we do have it legally binding as within our law. Then another element of the EU NDC is Fit for 55 package. So it's basically a set of policies that will help us reach the emissions reduction targets that we have. So this can include specific legislation on energy efficiency, on renewable energy, on deforestation, or actually reforestation, or use of land. So there's plenty of policies that will help us to pave the way to emissions reduction. And then we have another element, which is the focus on specific sectors and how to address the emissions of those sectors, particularly those that are difficult to decarbonize. And here comes in play carbon pricing, which is basically putting, well, price on carbon emissions. And then the last element are the financial mechanisms that will help with the flow of funds within during the transition, throughout the transition, but also between different stakeholders. So part of that will be the Social Climate Fund, which is basically to get some money from carbon pricing schemes and give it to people that will potentially be sensing or experiencing the impact of those policies. But more to that in a moment. So what is actually, I would say, the framework for us in Europe to implement our NDC is the European Green New Deal. And I already mentioned some of the elements of it. So as you see, climate neutrality by 2050, our key milestones in 2030, but also there's recommendation on 2040 targets. And there's a big discussion in the EU on what that target should be. And what targets should be actually approved. And now to go closer into the Social Climate Fund is that an important method or tool to make those emissions reduction happen is carbon pricing. And a tool that is allowing us to do this is the so-called EU emissions trading system. And this system means that any emissions, any entity that is emitting has to buy carbon allowances in order to sell their product. So for example, when we speak of the current emissions trading system, it takes into account the energy sector and the industry sector. If anybody wants to pollute, they have to buy those carbon allowances. And now this in turn makes it pretty difficult for the recipients of their products, because usually what happens is that if, for example, an energy company has to buy carbon allowances, they will put the price increase onto the customers. So we actually will have to pay because they have to pay. And so what's going to happen is that there are some challenges related to that. So one is that those least able to afford those changes will be affected the most. So those particularly low-income communities. And this is going to be particularly difficult for those low-income households and small businesses to really absorb all this price change. And now, again, what's going to happen is that this emissions trading system that we have, which currently focuses on energy sector and industry sector, will be expanded to road transport and buildings. And so what does that mean is that we will need to now deal with the impacts of how those prices are going to increase. For example, when we speak of using cars, using public transport that is still using fossil fuels, or when it comes to heating that is still powered with fossil fuels. And in order to support society, and particularly the most vulnerable groups, there comes basically the EU Social Climate Fund. So the purpose of that is to mitigate the social impact of that transition, so that they don't experience that kind of shock of energy price increases because of this carbon pricing scheme. And so we know that there's estimation of 65 billion euros available for the period of 2026 and 2032, so that those vulnerable communities will be supported with additional funds. And now when it comes to vulnerable communities, these are vulnerable households, these are vulnerable transport users, and there are micro entrepreneurs who might feel this shock the most. And then what the Social Climate Fund will do, it will provide different types of support. It can be the direct support, basically compensating for the increased energy costs. So those vulnerable households are not going to experience those price shocks. There can be transition assistance, so there will be separate funding to actually create solutions and improve infrastructure so that more people have access to clean energy and sustainable transport. So they are not supposed to do it themselves, but the state will support them. And so the example of that could be, for example, subsidies for retrofitting homes so that homes become more energy efficient, they use less energy, and then in that sense, the bills, the energy bills are reduced, and the vulnerable households do not have to pay too much for energy. And so what's going to happen is that the EU member states will need to plan how they actually want to use Social Climate Fund. How is that actually going to happen? So this is supposed to be done by June next year. And we know that the success of the Social Climate Fund will largely depend on how it will be actually implemented by member states. So as much as there are good intentions, the NDC, European NDC, actually already covers some social impact aspects. There's still the very question of how is it going to be actually implemented. And so what we need to do is to, first of all, of course, appreciate how crucial of a tool the Social Climate Fund is, because it actually really tries to bridge the gap between the ambitious climate action and the transition and the impact of it on the society. But at the same time, it really requires that careful planning and implementation by member states. And what we as a third sector or climate nonprofit organizations do in order to make sure that we do it right is that we offer support to decision makers. And I wanted to quickly mention something that Climate Reality Project recently supported and signed in with a coalition of other organizations whose logos you can actually see below, is that there was a special initiative, a policy briefing created for member states to make sure that those plans for Social Climate Fund implementation will be strong enough and will include I would say the three key aspects. First is that there has to be meaningful participation, so the public consultations now when developing the plans, so that the society can be actually heard in the process, and it is not something that is only top-down approach, kind of developed only by the public administration, but that they actually have the chance to speak with people who might be impacted by the carbon pricing mechanisms. There's another element which is about prioritizing long-term investments rather than short-term, short-sighted tools. So, for example, money handouts. So giving money is usually not going to solve a problem that is actually structural, which is about how insulated the homes are, or whether there's actually an electric grid that can allow people to have their own energy creation. So there's definitely the need to implement structural, real change rather than just giving people money. And then what is needed too is to mobilize funding beyond actually the Social Climate Fund. So also the member states will need to provide more funding for such solutions, those long-term solutions and actual structural solutions. For example, by reallocating funds that are currently going to fossil fuels. So there's definitely the need to increase that as well. And what I would like to close this presentation with, and how to make it successful, the implementation of tools like Social Climate Fund, which is just a European example, but there might be similar solutions in other countries as well, is that it really has to provide the opportunities for the participation of the society in the development process. And if you would like to already take for your first action in that, we can make the policy briefing available, which is called the Green Solidarity Guiding Principles for a Truly Just Social Climate Fund. And you can send this to your representatives. There's a specific group in each country that is dedicated to creating the plans on how to use Social Climate Fund. And if you would like to share with them, to provide them with this sort of briefing, which presents a wider societal overview of this, then feel free to download the policy briefing, and you can share it with the respective entities within each government. So here's actually a list. We can all make that available for you after the session, but here are basically the people, the ministries that are responsible for developing plans on how to use social climate fund. And since we still have a few years before it actually is implemented, and we have about less than a year to plan how to use it, we can definitely support our decision makers in making the right choices. So that would be all from me, and I will be happy to share the resources, the presentation, and the policy briefing, so you can read a bit more. What does it mean to have a truly social climate fund? So thank you so much. I haven't seen the questions yet or any comments, but I will be happy to answer a few questions.
Thank you so much, Gosia. We can start you off with a question already, is where does the money raised through carbon pricing go to?
So that's this is the, I would say, the way the money flows within those systems. So the carbon pricing ideally should go, I mean, the money raised through carbon pricing should ideally go to people who are actually going to experience the negative impacts of the change. So ideally, this should go to tools like social climate fund. So we can provide more information and more details about that, but ideally, this is the kind of systems thinking when we take money from people who are incentivized to actually emit less, and then we provide those funds to people who are on the other side of that equation, and who are experiencing the negative impacts of the transition.
Thanks so much. I don't see any other comments in the questions in the chat. Yes, actually one more, and then we'll move on with our program. And how might we anticipate what this looks like on a city or regional scale?
So that's where the plans come in. So I mentioned that there's that until mid next year, the countries, the member states, will have to come up with their plans on how actually they want to use the social climate fund, or how is it going to be structured. And so this might depend. So they actually are supposed to come up with the plans on how to use the fund. And so we don't really know how is it supposed to look like yet. Of course, there's plenty of solutions that are available in the policy briefing that I mentioned. So I think it's key to help to maybe not educate, but help decision makers to actually see what solutions the society needs. And those are mentioned in the policy briefing. But it will all depend on the decisions that the ministries or national governments will make when it comes to how they implement it, right? So it might actually vary from country to country or city to city. But so this is all going to be set in the plans that I mentioned to be submitted mid next year.
Thank you so much, Gosia. I think we're going to move on. We have one more thing to get through tonight, so please bear with us. I know we've had a lot of good information, and this whole session today, we've started off from justice focus, also gender and youth, but we've looked at justice focused international climate policies and how those also might look at a national level when we talk about NDCs as well. And also now we want to talk about how we're going to incorporate justice ourselves. So there's a fantastic saying that is think global, act local. Or in this case, maybe we'll start with think global, acting as an individual, or making those individual first steps. So we have been building up, this is our penultimate session, our almost last, but we have been building up every session skills and knowledge to take us to our end product. So I'm going to share my screen quickly. And what we have is for you as the last, I guess it is an assignment, but last idea is that we have an action proposal guideline. So this is an exercise to help guide you through an initiative, a project, an idea, and of course, It's never something that you would ever have to do by yourself as a lone individual, but we hope that this type of exercise can help you in creating a climate initiative or community engagement project that does take a justice-focused approach. So this is Jessica kindly dropped the link in the chat already. So if you look at the chat, it's right there. Some already put a thumbs up. I will also add a thumbs up so you can find it. But this is an action proposal guideline. Ideally, you will have this done by Friday, but you also have until next week, Wednesday, when we have our graduation ceremony. But this is a guideline tool that we hope you will use or that you can use in brainstorming an idea or getting a project started and getting that ball rolling. So we'll use the word project, action, and initiative as synonyms. And also, before we get into the nitty-gritty of this, the training platform will also host a collaborative page for projects where past, current, and future participants can upload initiatives and the goals to promote best practices and collaboration. And you'll learn more about that at the last session as well. So we start off with some basics. I'm just going to go through the form and then we'll have some time for questions. So if something is unclear, this is the time to ask us now. So we have the location, country, town. How does the project target climate justice? And what injustice are you targeting? Or climate injustice as well. So there's a few ways to understand this. We want you to explore what are the potential benefits of your project. What should the desired outcome be? And we also want to know the opposite. What are the potential negative impacts? What are the pushbacks? Where are you going to encounter roadblocks in your project? And how do you account for accessibility, equity, and cultural alignment? Which steps would you take to do so? Then, of course, we want to know what your key activities are going to be or activity. It can comprise of many steps, but what's your main goal? What is your aim? What are you hoping to achieve? And it can be a very, very ambitious goal. It can also be a smaller goal that just does something within your immediate community or neighborhood or small. So we've talked about communities last week. So that's an example of where you could think of tackling climate action in an equitable way or targeting climate justice in one of those communities. We would also then want to know, instead of just your big goal, of what are your immediate goals? So those are the first initial steps that you're going to take, and that type of thing as well. And I see the comments going quite quickly as well. And we will get to them, I hope. Then we are asking you for a timeline for those key activities, who your targeted community is, and what type of resources do you need? If that's in creating more movement of getting more people involved, is it space? You have the people, but you don't have any space. Maybe it's financial resources. And similarly, like we did in the community mapping exercise, where are your potential partnerships? Can you identify already where those avenues would be? And also if there's similar ongoing initiatives or other ones that you know of that you could maybe do some peer-to-peer support. You can also let us know if support from Climate Reality Europe would be needed. And there's some different options here. We're also going to ask the midterm goal, the long-term goal, and you can also write a short summary about your idea, which should include a short summary. Yes, we also, we're almost through and then we can start going through the questions, is if you would like to be paired with a mentor. We've teamed up with Global Shapers, so there's some mentoring available, so let us know and we can connect you, but it's not compulsory. And finally, would you be interested in collaborating with one of or more of your peers on this project or any other? Are you interested in collaboration? So this is the form, and you can fill it out tonight, tomorrow, before we start on Friday. But please, if you can, please have this done by Wednesday. Would be really helpful for us. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to look at the questions.
So maybe just quickly, there was a question about whether we can also send this form in a Word document so that you can brainstorm a little bit before you actually submit it. So I will send a Word document to all of you via email tomorrow. And then I see the question, are we expected to actually carry out the project? How realistic does it have to be? Or is it more theoretical? So we know that there's not really funding available for this. We are trying to, in the future, maybe see how we can support some projects that really have a realistic planning in place, and also some partners maybe where we see, okay, an implementation would be possible, and see how Climate Reality could support this. So we know that it is not easy, and there's a lot of time involvement that is needed and asked of you. So it can be only theoretical and just get the ball rolling, in your thinking about climate justice initiatives, and maybe if it's just seeing that there's a potential partner that you could contact, and then maybe in the future something will fall into place. But of course, it would also be very nice if a project would actually be implemented. And we have a lot of people here who are very passionate and who might want to connect, who are in the same city, who maybe lack some human resources, or who do not have, skills in social media or in project management, and then you can collaborate. So this is something that the training platform will hopefully help you with. But during the last session, I will share the screen and show you what types of new features we have on the platform.
Yeah, and maybe to add in as well, the same question that you started with, Jessica, is it theoretical or do I have to do it? We're not going to chase you down and make sure you're following an action plan. That is not something that we have capacity to do. But I will say this is the third time that we've run this climate justice training, or that will be completed on Friday. And we have seen some really great collaborations come as a result. We've also seen some collaborations begin and start to get the ball rolling on ideas that had just been ideas. So if you have an idea that you would like to develop, it's a good opportunity to do so. If you find yourself just wanting to collaborate on a project as well, we hope that filling out this form will help you support other initiatives and projects in the future, especially having now done this climate justice training. If you join maybe another climate initiative, that you can maybe be one of the people that says, wait a minute, have we actually done this in a way that's equitable and that's taken justice into account? So we would ask you to do it, even as a practice, just to support future initiatives, and not, maybe not tomorrow, but in the years to come. There's so much work to do, and I'm sure that we have so many motivated people that are here with us that we're all going to be part of it. And I see some stuff already in the chat. And some examples have been some signature campaigns has probably been one. And then we've also heard that it's helped support campaigns and initiatives that have already been in motion as a supplement to NGOs that have been running different types of campaigns on different levels in different environmental sectors, not only climate, but beyond. Are there any other questions?
I see that there was the idea to open up a LinkedIn group with everyone here. I know that in the beginning, especially, a lot of you shared your LinkedIn links here in the chat. Yeah, so I can maybe create a group and then send the link as an email, and then everyone who would like to join can just click on it instead of adding people, because this way it is all about consent. So that's a very nice idea.
Excellent. So I think we've had we learned a lot today. I think we had 3 fantastic speakers that shared a lot of knowledge. And we have regained the time a bit. And I do see other questions popping up now, and can we collaborate with other organizations? And absolutely, identify partnerships, identify allies. One thing that I think is really important when we're in this climate sphere is not one of us individually is carrying the weight of the world or the responsibility to solve the climate crisis by ourselves. It's definitely something that we need to collaborate on. So please find allies and support and build your team to make things happen. Individuals are powerful, but we're also even more powerful as a group. So please identify and who your allies are and work together. Are there any other questions? I saw in the chat that there's already some ideas for collaborations out there, so please get connected. But otherwise, I would, again, just ask you to go to the training platform and look at the form. And I also, I know on last Friday, many people had to leave early, but the final session is so inspiring. We always leave the most inspiring session to the end. And I would really encourage you, if you have the time, to stay through the entire 2 hours to do so, because it's going to be very special. So with that, I think we can close the session for tonight. Maybe we can stay online a few more minutes if there's any other questions that pop up, but since I don't see others coming. Then I would wish you all a lovely evening. So good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Good night.
night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you for the session.
Good night. Thank you.